Robert J. Sunderland, Niels Bohr Archive at Copenhagen, Denmark. Robert Sunderland is the head archivist at the Niels Bohr Archive in Copenhagen, Denmark. The archive is a private institution affiliated with the University of Copenhagen, the Niels Bohr Institute, and the Bohr family, and it holds a significant collection of historical documents related to Niels Bohr and the development of modern physics. Originally from Yorkshire, England, Mr. Sunderland has lived in Denmark for more than 30 years. He studied history at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom and at the University of Copenhagen. He has worked in the archival field for over 25 years, with previous positions at the Danish State Archives, the Danish Health and Interior Ministries, and the Propedel Museum. For the past 10 years, he has been associated with the Niels Bohr Archive, where he is involved in the preservation, organization, and management of its collection. A lecture on quantum spirit, the story of the people, and relationships behind the quantum revolution.
Thank you very much. A very nice afternoon for you from all of us here in Copenhagen, and a nice evening to all of you in India. As has been said, I am the archivist at the Niels Bohr Archive, and what I'd like to tell you about today is a little of the human stories behind the birth of quantum physics, and I've called the lecture Quantum Spirit. I hope you enjoy it. The Niels Bohr Institute opened in 1920 in Copenhagen. It was slightly delayed in its opening, but these are the pictures from the opening day. And what you can see on the slide here is the original institute building, and to the left of the picture, Niels Bohr's house on site at the institute. This is vitally important for what happened next. The picture furthest to the left in the foreground is the entire staff of the institute on the opening day. We have Jacobsen, who, as you can see from the little inset, was the laboratory assistant at the time, but he later became a prime member of the staff and professor in his own right. And he was in charge of both the Institute's cyclotron and later the experimental reactor at the town of Risø to the west of Copenhagen. Then we have a Norwegian, Svein Rosalund, and he was an astronomer, later one of the pioneers of infrared astronomy that depended very much on the theories of Bohr. Next to him is George Hevesy from Hungary. At this time he'd been at the Institute for about 6 months, and later in that year he would be the discoverer of a whole new element, hafnium. Next to him is Hans Marius Hansen, later the rector of Copenhagen University, and at this time one of the assistant professors. Next to him is Niels Bohr, and in the front row we have James Franck, later a Nobel Prize winner from Germany, Hendrik Hamers, assistant professor from the Netherlands, and we have Betty Schultz. She was the secretary at the Niels Bohr Institute between 1920 and 1970. And what I would like to say right now is a big thank you to Mrs. Schultz, because without her work in archiving Niels Bohr's papers, his correspondence and so on, I wouldn't be able to tell you very much at all today. I'd like to just go back and point out the professor's house again, because as you can see, it's right next to the Institute. And this was vitally important during the quantum revolution, in that so many scientists came from abroad. And if you came from abroad, you were a long way from home. Being a long way from home, you needed to be able to relax and have a little bit of family care. And this is where Margrethe Bohr, she's the lady in the center of the main picture, came in. She was the wife of Niels Bohr. They married in 1912 a year before Bohr published his theory on atoms and molecules, and they were married until Bohr's death in 1962, so 50 years of marriage. This meant that if you came to the Institute, you were part of an extended family. This meant that you, at the Institute itself, were well looked after. Margrethe Bohr would drink tea with you once a week, and then you were invited, as you can see in the picture on, to the left of the screen, to Niels Bohr's summer house. There the family is joined by Leon Rosenfeld, a Belgian physicist who had a long association with the Institute. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the children's Uncle Werner. Werner Heisenberg lived on site at the Institute. In the main building, there had been an apartment on the top floor of the main building since 1920. When Bohr's family became too large for the apartment, they moved out. It was here that Werner Heisenberg lived off and on between 1925 and 1927. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the practical situation behind the quantum revolution. In his letters to Bohr, he looks forward to going back to his apartment, and Niels Bohr as well refers to it as Heisenberg's apartment. You were very much brought into an extended family, and the children grew up with some of the most famous physicists as uncles and aunts. The Institute was very international right from day one, and I've picked a few stories here to tell you about. And the first is the Japanese physicists. I've got a little film playing in the background here. It's two laboratory assistants whose names were Yoshio Nishina, you can see him here, and Bidu Busan Ray, an Indian physicist. They were both at the Institute in the early 1920s, and I'll just play that film again. There's not very much of it, I'm afraid, but it's from 1925, and you can actually see them working in the laboratory. These people were subject to a kind of culture shock that we in the 21st century cannot appreciate. We travel to other countries, but we can expect to find food there that we recognize. We can find culture that we recognize too. In anno 1921, when these people first arrived, that certainly wasn't the case. Nishina, I have seen a copy of one of his letters home from London, complains, for example, at the time that he was starving. There was nothing that Nishina was used to eating in London. However, in Denmark, the duty of care was taken to such an extent that Margrethe Bohr would go out and visit the guest houses where these people were staying to make sure that there was food suitable for them to eat, that the sheets were being washed, and that they were well looked after. Some of the greatest names have been treated to this, and the main photograph, which I'd like you to look at very carefully because we're going to come back to it in a way later on in the lecture, is the lecture theatre at the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen. The room is exactly as it was in this picture today, including, if you can see behind the gentleman sat on looking at the globe on the desk, you can see multiple blackboards with handles that you can keep pulling down until you've finished with the equations you're writing. We've got Wolfgang Pauli in that picture, we've got Niels Bohr, we've got Hendrik Kramers again, and Svein Rosseland, and with his back to the camera, Paul Ehrenfest. Paul Ehrenfest, tragically, later in life, died by his own hand. But he is another one who benefited when coming to the Institute from the very human values that Niels Bohr and his wife displayed to their guests. When these people left Copenhagen, they forged relationships that lasted a lifetime. Unfortunately, Ray died as a very young man. He was only 50 years old. But even in 1961, when Niels Bohr visited India, he was taken to Ray's family's house, and we have pictures of them drinking tea outside. We also know that Yoshio Nishina came to visit Niels Bohr shortly before his own death in 1949. For those of you who don't know, Nishina was the father of nuclear physics in Japan. He was also the man that they sent to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to find out what had just occurred there in 1945. When he was probably very ill, he unfortunately died in 1951 as a result of his exposure to radiation. He returned a final time to Copenhagen to visit Niels Bohr. And on his return to Japan, he wrote a letter, which the final paragraph is very beautiful. It simply says, "I've seen the world. What we need to do now is work together and work for peace. Because if we don't, there really is no future." In 1950, Niels Bohr expanded on these. In 1950, Niels Bohr expanded on these theories, and he went to the United Nations and wrote an open letter to them, basically expressing the same sentiments. And so, to the birth of quantum mechanics. From a human level, it's important to know that in the end of 1924, Werner Heisenberg came to the Institute. He'd first met Niels Bohr 2 years before in Göttingen, but now he was a guest of the Institute. Bohr provided funds and provided a stipend for him while he was in Copenhagen. Bohr and Heisenberg shared a somewhat complex relationship. They could irritate each other. Indeed, when Heisenberg made many of his great breakthroughs, Niels Bohr had gone on a skiing holiday to unwind from what had become quite a tense working relationship. But they were also very, very close friends. And this is something that extended. Many people think that Bohr and Heisenberg drifted apart after World War II, and that's not true. Heisenberg, even after World War II, visited Bohr at his summer house and came to be a guest at the Institute. I have this wonderful picture of them on the left of the screen where they are both carrying skis. Now, they're not in the Alps or in Austria or in Norway, as they were on many occasions on skis. They are, in fact, walking out of the Niels Bohr Institute and are going to ski in the park behind them. And if you look to the right of the screen, you can see Niels Bohr and Heisenberg in the 1930s enjoying a bottle of Carlsberg and their lunch at the Institute's canteen. Heisenberg and Bohr wrote to each other up to 3 times a day, and it's here that we are blessed with some excellent sources for the development of quantum mechanics, including one famous letter from 1925, when Heisenberg has retreated to the island of Helgoland from the east coast of the Jutland Peninsula. It's a German island. And he'd gone there for the specific reason that there weren't very many flowering plants there, and Heisenberg was suffering terribly from hay fever. And the palpable excitement in Bohr's following letters trying to get Heisenberg to come as quickly back to Copenhagen as humanly possible. It's so apparent through the next 4 or 5 letters. And indeed, Heisenberg did come back. He lectured at the Institute. He had his own apartment in the main building, as I said before, between 1925 and 1927. One touching result of Heisenberg and Bohr's friendship is that, and it unfortunately makes it very difficult for foreign historians of science to study some of this correspondence, is that Niels Bohr so wanted Heisenberg to be his successor at the Institute that he never stopped writing to Heisenberg in Danish. Heisenberg apparently learned to speak Danish very quickly within a few months. Unfortunately, that does not carry through to his correspondence, which is always in German. But Niels Bohr, right up until after the war, when he switches to English when writing to Heisenberg, he writes to Heisenberg in Danish, and this is a sign that he'd always wished that Heisenberg could have been his successor at the Institute. As it turned out, the war did cause a break in their correspondence, though not in their friendship. There is the whole story of Heisenberg's mysterious visit to Copenhagen in 1941. But their relationship after the war was to a certain extent unchanged. Heisenberg was Niels Bohr's guest on numerous occasions, both at the summer house, the only house Niels Bohr actually owned for himself, and at the Institute. What did come between them was a book written by an author called Robert Jungk, the English title of which is Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, in which Heisenberg appears during the war to have, or after the war, to have tried to put himself in a better light and say that he was assuring Professor Bohr that he was not going to let Hitler get an atom bomb. However, Niels Bohr, after the war, wrote numerous letters, none of which he actually sent. But they basically said, Heisenberg, that is not what we remember. We remember you came to Copenhagen and asked me to support German intellectual overtures to the Danish population. And remember that Denmark was occupied by the Germans during World War II. The truth of the matter is I'm sure that Heisenberg did approach Niels Bohr in such a way, but I'm sure he also knew that the answer would be no, and that Niels Bohr would not be in any way supporting German intellectual pursuits in Copenhagen. But I don't think, I think that Heisenberg was very sure he would get a no, but he was being watched and expected to ask that question. That's my personal view at any rate. At the end of this period, Heisenberg was awarded a professorate in Leipzig in Germany, and he chose that rather than being Bohr's successor in Copenhagen. And thereafter, Heisenberg was a visitor to the Institute. I feel it necessary to mention the one person who really was not a part of the gang, for want of a better expression, and that is our friend Albert Einstein. I've already pointed out Paul Ehrenfest in one of the previous pictures. And what we have here is a picture of Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein, the main picture, in Paul Ehrenfest's apartment in Leiden in the Netherlands. And the reason they're there is Ehrenfest could not bear the fact that Einstein and Bohr were in disagreement over quantum mechanics. Albert Einstein is very famous for a quotation about quantum mechanics because it's all based on probability. And he very famously said, "I do not believe that God plays dice." Now, this was first brought up at the Solvay conference in 1927. The conference is held in Belgium every 3 years. The picture of Bohr and Einstein walking in the street is from 1930, where Einstein, he mounted a full-scale attack on quantum mechanics, and he did it via Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Basically, that you can know where a particle is in an atom or how fast it's moving, but not both at the same time. And Einstein proposed a thought experiment, which is the box that we have drawn here very neatly on the blackboard. And the box is on a spring. There is a little arrow so you can see if the box gains or loses mass. Inside the box is a clock and a light. And when you open the door of the box, one light photon comes out. The box is ever so slightly lighter. By checking the box and knowing the speed of light already, you should know where that light photon is and be able, by using the clock precisely, to position the light photon, thereby knowing the speed and location of that photon at the same time. Now, the picture, as I said, at the bottom of them walking in the street is taken at the Solvay conference in 1930, and I should just point out, I cannot prove this, but I rather think that it's just after Einstein has told Niels Bohr this, because Einstein's facial expression is one of extreme satisfaction, and Niels Bohr looks rather worried. Now, as it turned out, Bohr thought about Einstein's thought experiment, and the next day he said to Einstein, "Where was your clock?" And Einstein said, "In the box." "Ah, my friend," said Bohr, "if the clock is in the box and the box is in motion, according to your theory of general relativity, the clock must necessarily be slow. Space and time are the same thing. And if so, you cannot use it to plot the position of the light photon. Therefore, the uncertainty principle stands." And just as a little aside, I should say that we've had one slightly inaccurate quote today, and that is that Niels Bohr once said, "If you think you understand quantum physics, you don't understand quantum physics." It's not actually true. What he said, and it's reported by a Dutch physicist called Casimir, is that if you are not dizzy because of quantum physics and you've not understood it, then Richard Feynman seems to have misremembered that quote. And the quote, if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't understand quantum physics, is actually rather more Feynman than Bohr. But the quote about God playing dice is absolutely true, because if you look in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, there is a letter from the 4th of April 1949, and it's Einstein thanking Niels Bohr for an article in a Festschrift to celebrate Einstein's 70th birthday. And in the second paragraph, he begins by saying, "Today is not one of the occasions on which God is playing dice, i.e., I am 70, and you can't change that." But when I talk about the quantum spirit in Copenhagen, Einstein is perhaps the most conspicuous absence. There were, however, many others, and there was a real community spirit here. This is the very first conference held at the Niels Bohr Institute in 1929. On the front row, there is Ehrenfest, there is Gamow, there is Charles Galton, Darwin, Oscar Klein from Sweden, Sven Rosseland again from Norway. And they also had a social life that was just as inclusive and just as important to their esprit de corps, if you will. For example, they made their own version of Goethe's Faust in 1932. The jokes in it are very much in-jokes. As was said in the very nice introduction before, I've been 10 years at this archive and I still would not profess to understand the jokes. Another publication, in the broadest sense of the word, was the Journal of Jocular Physics. The Journal of Jocular Physics was published every 10 years when Niels Bohr turned 50, 60, and 70. And physicists from all over the world sent their humorous articles in, again, very much in jokes. The conferences were held at Copenhagen, not every year, but fairly regularly from 1929 right up until the Second World War, and to a certain extent afterwards. They had people from all over the world. I would point out one T.S. Chang from China, who's on the third row in the middle. And as you can see, they included people like Wolfgang Pauli and Werner Heisenberg, Rudolf Peierls, Felix Bloch, and you can just about see him behind the bar here at the far right of the picture, Edward Teller. If you look at the front row as well, you can see that there are objects on the board there. There is a small trumpet in front of Heisenberg. There is a small cannon between Pauli and Gamov. And if you look very carefully to the far right of the picture, there is a little soldier boy doll, Clockwork, who plays the drums. The idea was, if they liked your idea that you presented at the conference, then you get a fanfare on the trumpet. If they did not like it, they would shoot it down with the cannon. Though I have to confess, I don't know quite how they did that, but it sounds awfully dangerous in a small lecture hall. Instead of applause, they would wind up the drummer boy and he would give a little drumming session on the drum. The pictures in the top corner are part of commemorative photo albums presented to people who have been at the Institute for a longer period of time. And I have some pictures there that, if you can see them, on the left-hand side, we have the Institute's dog, whose name was Put. And Put seems to have got into the papers, and Hilda Levy, who was one of the assistants at the Institute, she seems to be very frustrated by this. This particular album was made in honor of James Frank, who'd been working at the Institute after he'd fled Nazi Germany. Frank was Jewish during the 1930s and before he left for America. And one of the experiments we can just see, if you can see on the left-hand side with a bright light, is that they seem to be trying to amalgamate Danish beer and ice cream together. And if you look to the very far right in the top corner, you can see a beer label and a flash of lightning, and probably, I hope this is clear enough on the presentation, that you can see at the bottom there is a picture of the Institute, which proves that it's Carlsberg beer that was powering the quantum revolution. But the good times, I'm afraid, could not last forever, and the dark times came during the Second World War. Because people had come from all over the world to the Institute, they came from all walks of life as well. And there are some coincidences which, when looked at with hindsight, are remarkable. In the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, there are 3 men eating lunch at the Institute. The 2 to the right of the picture, the gentleman with the dark hair and round glasses, his name was Victor Weisskopf. Within a few years of this picture being taken, Weisskopf would flee Germany because of his Jewish heritage, and he would go on to the United States, where he became a member of the Manhattan Project and worked at Los Alamos. The young man who has got his back slightly towards us is Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. In the same period, von Weizsäcker will become Werner Heisenberg's assistant in Germany in what they called the Uranverein, or Uranium Club, the scientists who were trying to develop an atom bomb in Germany. The central picture on skis is Niels Bohr, but it's in the mountains of Nevada around Los Alamos. It is the only picture we have of Niels Bohr during his wartime service. Bohr himself, I should underline here, did not actually work for the Manhattan Project. He worked for the British Tube Alloys Project and was only in America as an observer on 3 occasions to visit Los Alamos and report back to the British. What you can see in the background is what happened when Bohr fled Denmark. He fled Denmark mostly because his Jewish heritage put him in danger in 1943. Denmark was invaded in 1940, but for the first 3 years of the Nazi occupation, things were not as bad as in the rest of Europe. This meant that Niels Bohr remained in Denmark until 1943, when his hand was forced when the Germans took direct control. He escaped to Sweden on a fishing boat. The rest of his family escaped, and Niels Bohr and his 4th son Orebor. For those of you who, well, there won't be anybody Danish watching this, but AAGE in Denmark gives you the boy's name Or, the father of Paul Bohr, who you're going to hear from later. And Niels and Or went together to Great Britain and then to the United States. What you can see in the background is what happened to the Institute afterwards. The Institute was occupied by the German forces, and for a while, 2 of the employees were taken into what the Germans referred to as protective custody to be questioned. However, it has to be said that it was Werner Heisenberg who, in the January of 1944, heard about this situation and came to Denmark to make sure that the Germans were evicted from the Institute and that work continue there as it had before. In the bottom right-hand corner of the picture, you can see the Germans had made a plan of the Institute. We are lucky that one of the employees, Jens Burild, who was taken in for questioning, wrote an account of his interrogation as soon as he was released. And it is rather comedic in its contents, in that the Germans were looking for essentially vast amounts of uranium and asking Burild whether they had managed to go critical with it. As Burild said, really, we only have 0.5 gram of radium in the entire institute, so that would not be feasible. Werner Heisenberg interrogated the people who'd been interrogating Burild and said, "What is it you're looking for?" When they honestly answered they didn't know, he basically told them to get out of the institute. I would also like, just towards the end of this lecture, to show you the results from a scientific point of view. And I'm not going to be entirely uncontroversial here. I wanted to show you the Nobel winners who had been at the Institute for extended periods of time. And what I've made as my own rule here is to say who was there for longer than 2 months, and if so, they can have their picture there. There is one person here who did not win the Nobel Prize, but I think when I tell the story, you'll agree with me that she should have done. So, to start off, the most important and the first of them was Werner Heisenberg. Werner Heisenberg won the Nobel Prize in 1927, and he won it for his work on quantum mechanics. By this time, he was at the University of Leipzig and had moved away from Copenhagen, but for a period of around 2 years, he was resident in Copenhagen. Also, a regular visitor and one who stayed for more than 2 months was Paul Dirac, who won in 1930. We also have Harold Urey. Harold Urey was a guest already in the early 1920s. He's one of the first Americans to stay at the Institute, and he was at the Institute between 1924 and 1925. Otto Stark was a regular visitor to the conferences, and also in the the late 1920s, he was at the Institute for a period of 3 months. George Hevesy worked at the Institute twice. He won his Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1943 for his work with medical isotopes. He was a founding member, as we saw before on one of the earlier slides, of the Institute's staff. He discovered hafnium in 1922 and, as I said, won the Nobel Prize in 1943. He left the Institute because he was also a Jewish refugee. If you are awarded a Nobel Prize, they offer you Swedish citizenship. And in 1943, when he won the Nobel Prize, he took it because it was for his own safety. Although he left the Institute, he remained a visitor there for the rest of his life. This is the somewhat controversial one, and that's Lisa Meitner. Lisa Meitner had known Bohr since 1920. And of course, she is famous for her work with Otto Hahn in Germany. Basically, they were the first to discover fission. Lisa Meitner's final experiments were made after she was exiled because of a Jewish heritage from Germany. And she made those final experiments on the cyclotron in Copenhagen, along with her nephew Otto Frisch. When the results were sent down to Germany, of course, as a Jewish woman under the Third Reich, her name never went on the paper. And she was therefore, quite wrongly, in my view, never awarded the Nobel Prize. So you'll have to excuse me today. I've insisted on having Lisa along as an honorary Nobel Prize winner. Wolfgang Pauli, who we saw in several photographs earlier, he won the Nobel Prize in 1945, and he was a guest at the Institute for extended periods several times in the 1920s, and was a fast visitor during the 1930s at all the conferences. Felix Bloch, who you may have seen on some of the conference photographs, he was a visitor to the Institute and stayed for several months early in 1930. Max Born visited the Institute over extended periods, first in 1925 and later in 1936, after having fled Germany and on his way to Great Britain. And winning the Nobel Prize in 1960, I've chosen this one because I have no idea why he's pulling that funny face, but that's Lev Landau, a Ukrainian physicist who won the Nobel Prize in 1960. Now, you would think that I'd run out of Nobel Prize winners, but I haven't quite, because there is this one picture here, and you can already see one Nobel Prize winner, that's Lev Landau. There are two other eminent physicists here on skis, Edward Teller of the Manhattan Project fame, and the Russian scientist George Gamow on his motorbike. But there is another Nobel Prize winner there, though it is not Teller or Gamow. It's the little boy in short pants who stood between Landau in the sidecar and Gamow on the motorbike. And that is Niels Bohr's son, Ove Bohr, who won the Nobel Prize in 1975 for his work with the structure of the nucleus. Today, the Niels Bohr Institute remains international, and this is the legacy of Niels Bohr's time. I told you to remember the picture taken in the lecture hall. The top left of the photograph, we had a group of students last year who come from, if I remember, Argentina, Ethiopia via France, Germany, Denmark, and Italy, who all wanted to recreate the picture from 1921. We also have a picture in the center in color of, Christian Joas, who unfortunately can't be here today because he's on paternity leave, and Paula Bohr in the orange dress in the middle, the Indian ambassador, and the at the time leader of the Niels Bohr Institute, Jan. I'm sorry, the name's gone, but they are all outside the institute. It's taken the year before last, and that was an invitation via Paula of the Indian ambassador and his wife. We also have the group working on one of the computer projects, who range from China, Japan, Denmark, Germany, and France. And we have El Mahadevan, who gave the Niels Bohr lecture last year. And I've put this because he really has learned a lesson from Margareta Bohr. If you can see on the picture, it says coffee, tea, and cake are served at 1545. A very important part of Mrs. Bohr's legacy. As you can see, every year we have photographed. This is a tradition that started in Niels Bohr's time, I cannot tell you exactly how many nationalities are there, but a considerable amount. The quantum spirit remains here in Copenhagen, and our international profile is what has made this institute and the quantum revolution possible. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert, for your wonderful, talk, beautifully detailed and deeply humanizing talk, through photographs and stories. You brought Niels Bohr to life, not just as a scientist, but as a person of humility, vision, and quite strength. Just to start with, I mean, just you shared this picture of Einstein and Bohr, right? Where we know when Einstein was kind of challenging the idea of quantum mechanics. So how did Bohr handle this kind of emotional, at the same time such an intellectual weight of defending his views against such a towering figure like Einstein? Is there any archive which gives us this sense of how this personal or professional these exchanges were?
Oh, most definitely. You already saw the letter from Einstein's 70th birthday. This was a very good-natured. I should point out this was very good-natured. They remained friends for life. They so the whole controversy basically lasts a lifetime, but it goes quiet after 1933 because the Solvay conference in 1930, Bohr defeats Einstein's thought experiment, as I said. They were both on the organizing committee for the 1933 conference. But Einstein never went because Hitler won the election in Germany, and Einstein never went back to Germany. So he was kind of isolated out in America. And when I say this lasted a lifetime, it's true. On the 17th of November 1962, Niels Bohr gives an interview to the American Institute of Physics. This is available on their website, I think both as audio and also as a transcript. And Bohr draws that box on the blackboard. We have a picture of it in the archive. And then finishes the interview by saying, "Gentlemen, I'm very tired. Can we do the rest tomorrow?" But he couldn't because that was the day he died. So that was literally something that lasted a lifetime. And the box was the last thing Niels Bohr drew on the blackboard.
And I will read out the question. This is from Dr. Bharat Pandey from Government PG College, Ranikhet, Uttarakhand. He's asking, Niels Bohr believed that embracing uncertainty and complementarity was not only key to understanding quantum mechanics, but also essential for fostering openness in human dialogue and international cooperation. In today's polarized and rapidly changing world, how can Bohr's philosophy guide us in building more resilient, open-minded, scientific and global communities?
I would say that I would actually use Bohr's own words. He had later in life the complementarity theory. And this was not only something he saw as a scientific theory, it was something he looked at as part of human nature. During the 1930s, he had helped countless physicists and other scientists and intellectuals escape from places like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And he was instrumental in them being able to go on to places like the United States and Great Britain, where many of them, for example, became, as I already said with Victor Weisskopf, became members of the Manhattan Project, and therefore had a great effect on history. His ideas that opposites were complementary are that basically everybody counts. You shouldn't. During World War II, he gives, when he escapes to Great Britain, he speaks to what is called the Academic Assistance Council, this organization that exists to this day to help scientists in difficult political situations. And he says something along the lines of, until your own family, and remember Bohr's family have been deeply affected by what happened in occupied Denmark, until your own family is threatened, you do not realize the wrongness of excluding people because of race, creed, color, whatever. Everybody must be given an opportunity. And I think in our world today, more than ever, and the evidence from the 1920s with this international hive mind in Copenhagen, it's empirically proven that you need cooperation, and you need it in spite of whatever cultural differences might be thrown up by society. And I think it's something that to the end of his life, Niels Bohr believed very, very deeply indeed.
It's a question from Aniket. Yeah. So he says, did the World War sideline the research in deeper philosophical aspects of quantum physics?
I would say that, and I tried to give this impression during the talk, that to a certain extent it was hijacked by events. That suddenly these people who, like Weizsäcker and von Weizsäcker, who had been drinking tea together in Copenhagen in 1936, suddenly were engaged in separate projects whose ultimate goal, it must be said, is weapons of an incredibly destructive nature. And I would say in that case, in that sense, yes, to a certain extent, the World War has taken us away from this. And it was something that Niels Bohr spent the rest of his life trying to redress. For example, the open letter to the United Nations, working for peace, working together, trying to recreate this hive mind that transcends cultures in Copenhagen.
The next question, maybe we can take one more question. It's from Mr. Shravan. He's asking, according to you, how quantum mechanics can aid for achieving peace at individual and universal level?
How can quantum mechanics? I think I'm honestly giving very similar answers to these questions, but I think that working on projects such as we've already mentioned, the quantum computer, that's also been worked on in Copenhagen, along with visiting Indian, Chinese, Japanese, and other students. I would be here all day if I listed all the nationalities. So please, just taking some examples. When people have worked together, suddenly a shared goal is so powerful. I was so surprised when I arrived at the institute that there were two guys down the corridor from me who shared an office. One from Israel and the other one from Iran. Now, according to what we see on the news, that should never happen. But it does, and it happens in Copenhagen, and it still happens in the 21st century. I think that a shared goal of the peaceful use of quantum mechanics has, like so many other completely necessary scientific endeavors today, when people cooperate, they cannot be anything but friends, or it will not happen.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Yes. You are very welcome, and very greetings from us in Copenhagen. Best of luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing all this valuable information and archival records with us. This was really amazing to have you with us here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye.